Picture this. You're standing at the gates of an ancient city, and rising before you is a tower made entirely of human skulls. Thousands of empty eye sockets staring down at you, the smell of death thick in the air, and carved into stone nearby, a message that reads, "This is what happens to those who defy Assyria." Sound like something from a horror movie. This was Tuesday morning in the ancient world. The Assyrians didn't just conquer cities, they performed open-heart surgery on the human psyche itself. They discovered something that modern torture experts and dictators are still using today. The most powerful weapon isn't the sword that kills the body, but the fear that kills the soul. Here's what they figured out 3,000 years ago that your social media feeds are exploiting right now. Systematic terror doesn't just defeat enemy. It programs entire populations to defeat themselves. The Assyrians turned psychological warfare into an art form so twisted that even their own soldiers developed what we now recognize as PTSD. But here's the truly terrifying part: they didn't build these skull towers just to scare their enemies. They built them to scare you. Yes, you. Because the same psychological mechanisms that made ancient peoples bow down in helpless terror are the exact same ones being used to control your thoughts, your choices, and your behavior every single day. By the end of this video, you'll never look at crowds, authority figures, or even your own fears the same way again. Here's how they broke the human spirit itself. Let me paint you a picture of the ancient world around 900 BCE. While other civilizations were playing checkers, the Assyrians were playing 4D psychological chess. The Assyrian Empire stretched from modern-day Iraq to Egypt, covering over 500,000 square miles. But here's what made them different from every other ancient superpower: they didn't just want to rule your body. They wanted to own your mind. Most ancient armies would march up to a city, fight a battle, win or lose, and move on. The Assyrians, they turned warfare into theater. Deadly, calculated theater designed to reprogram human behavior at the deepest level. Picture King Ashurnasirpal Roman II sitting in his palace around 870 BCE, surrounded by scribes carefully documenting every torture technique, every display of brutality, every psychological experiment performed on conquered peoples. These weren't savages acting on impulse. These were the world's first behavioral scientists, and their laboratory was the entire human population. They discovered something that modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed. The human brain cannot distinguish between witnessing extreme violence and experiencing it directly. When you see another person suffering, your mirror neurons activate the same pain pathways as if it were happening to you. The Assyrians weaponized empathy itself. But here's where it gets really dark: they didn't stop at random brutality. They developed a systematic methodology, a step-by-step process for breaking down human resistance that was so effective, it influenced every authoritarian regime that came after them. Think about the last time you saw something horrifying on the news. Did you feel that knot in your stomach, that helpless feeling, that instinctive urge to just look away and not get involved? Congratulations, you just experienced the exact same psychological response that made ancient peoples surrender their cities without a fight. The Romans studied Assyrian tactics. The Nazis copied their playbook. Modern marketing executives use their techniques to make you buy products you don't need. Political campaigns deploy their strategies to make you vote against your own interests. Why does this matter today? Because right now, while you're watching this video, there are systems in place designed to make you feel exactly as helpless as those ancient peoples standing before towers of skulls. The Assyrians discovered that physical walls can be broken, but psychological walls last forever. They learned to build prisons inside people's minds, prisons so effective that the inmates not only lock themselves in, They hand over the keys to their captors, ready to see how they did it. Because once you understand this system, you can never be controlled by it again. The year is 865 BCE. The city-state of Suru has been under siege for weeks. Food is running low, but the walls are holding. The defenders have hope. Then, at dawn, something appears outside their gates that will haunt their nightmares forever. The Assyrian army begins constructing what ancient records call a pyramid of heads. Not metaphorically, literally. Stone by stone, skull by skull, they're building a monument to terror using the heads of prisoners from the last city that dared resist them. Imagine standing on those walls, watching enemy soldiers systematically stacking human skulls like building blocks. The smell carries on the wind. The geometric precision of it all makes it somehow worse. This isn't random violence. It's calculated engineering. But wait, that's not the most twisted part. King Ashurnasirpal II isn't just building this display for the people of Suru. He's documented that he had scribes present, recording every reaction, every moment when the defenders' faces changed from defiance to horror to resignation. He was conducting real-time psychological research. The Assyrian records, preserved on clay tablets, read like a torture manual written by a behavioral psychologist. I flayed the chief men who had rebelled, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I immured in the pillar, some I impaled upon stakes around the pillar. Picture this scene, prisoners being skinned alive while still conscious, their screams echoing across the battlefield. But here's the psychological masterstroke: they kept some prisoners alive, mutilated but breathing, and forced them to walk around the skull towers as living advertisements of Assyrian power. Can you imagine the mind-breaking horror of being a defender on those walls, watching human beings reduced to walking warnings? But the Assyrians discovered something even more effective than death. They found that partial destruction was more psychologically devastating than complete annihilation. They would gouge out one eye, cut off one hand, or sever one foot, creating what we now understand as learned helplessness on a massive scale. These mutilated survivors were then sent to other cities as living messengers. Imagine a group of partially blinded, limping former warriors arriving at your gates with a simple message. This is what Assyria does to those who resist. Your city is next. The psychological impact was so severe that many cities began surrendering before the Assyrian army even arrived. Word of mouth became their most powerful weapon. Fear traveled faster than their chariots. Here's where it gets really calculating. The Assyrians realized that killing everyone leaves no witnesses. But leaving traumatized survivors creates exponential terror. One mutilated messenger could psychologically defeat an entire city without a single Assyrian soldier dying in battle. King Sennacherib perfected this system around 700 BCE. His records boast, "I cut their throats like lambs. I cut off their precious lives as one cuts a string. Like the many waters of a storm, I made their gullets and entrails run down upon the wide earth." But notice the language: like lambs, like cutting string, like storm waters. He's not just describing violence, he's creating poetry out of brutality. This was performance art designed to embed terror so deeply in human consciousness that it would be passed down through generations. The city of Suru lasted exactly 3 more days after the skull pyramid was completed. Not because their walls were broken, but because their spirits were shattered. Ancient records show that the defenders began abandoning their posts. Families started fleeing in the night. The city leaders held emergency meetings where they didn't discuss military strategy, they debated the terms of their surrender. The Assyrians had discovered something that modern marketing executives now call social proof. People look to others to determine appropriate behavior. When you see mass surrender, mass terror, mass helplessness. Your brain automatically calibrates that as the normal response. But here's the truly diabolical part: the skull towers weren't just psychological weapons against enemies. They were also control mechanisms for Assyrian subjects. Citizens of the empire would pass these monuments during travel, constant reminders of what happened to those who defied the system. Imagine living in a world where every major road featured displays of human suffering, where terror architecture was as common as traffic signs. Your brain would be in a constant state of low-level fear, making you more compliant, more submissive, more willing to accept authority without question. The Assyrians turned an entire civilization into what psychologists now call trauma-bonded populations, groups of people so psychologically damaged by systematic terror that they develop emotional attachments to their oppressors as a survival mechanism. Sound familiar? It should, because this exact same system is being used on you right now, every single day, through your news feeds, your entertainment, and your social media algorithms. But that's not even the worst part yet. Let me explain what was actually happening inside the brains of those ancient people, because understanding this will change how you see modern manipulation forever. When you witness extreme violence, your brain releases a cocktail of stress hormones: cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. In small doses, these chemicals help you survive threats. But when you're exposed to systematic terror like the Assyrian skull displays, something catastrophically different happens. Your brain literally rewires itself. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, responsible for forming memories, starts shutting down to protect you from trauma. But here's the twisted part: your prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for rational decision-making, goes offline entirely. You're left with a brain that's constantly scanning for threats, but incapable of logical resistance. This is exactly what the Assyrians wanted: populations that were neurologically programmed for submission. Modern neuroscience has a name for this: learned helplessness. Martin Seligman discovered it in the 1970s using dogs in controlled experiments. But the Assyrians were conducting the same experiments on humans 3,000 years earlier, except their laboratory was the entire ancient world. Here's how it works: when you repeatedly witness or experience traumatic events that you cannot control or escape, your brain begins to generalize that helplessness to all situations, even ones where escape is actually possible. Picture those ancient peoples who had seen the skull towers, witnessed the flaying displays, heard the stories of systematic brutality. Their brains learned a simple equation: resistance equals extreme suffering. Over time, this became so deeply embedded that they stopped even considering resistance as an option. But the Assyrians discovered something even more psychologically devastating than learned helplessness. They found that intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest psychological bonds. Think about it: if they had been consistently brutal to everyone, people might have become desensitized or united in resistance. Instead, they used a calculated pattern of extreme mercy followed by extreme cruelty. Some cities that surrendered were treated well, even rewarded. Others that surrendered were still destroyed as examples. This created what we now recognize as trauma bonding on a civilizational scale. Entire populations began to emotionally attach to their Assyrian overlords because occasionally, just occasionally, cooperation was rewarded instead of punished. Your brain cannot handle this kind of psychological unpredictability. It creates a state called cognitive dissonance, where your mind tries to resolve conflicting information by changing your beliefs to match your circumstances. Ancient peoples began to believe that Assyrian rule was not only inevitable, but actually beneficial. Here's the truly terrifying part: this same psychological mechanism is why abuse victims often defend their abusers. It's why people stay in toxic relationships, toxic jobs, and toxic political systems. The human brain will literally rewrite its own moral code to avoid confronting the reality of its helplessness. The Assyrians also understood something that modern propagandists call the availability heuristic. The more vividly you can imagine something happening, the more likely you believe it is to happen. By creating these visceral, unforgettable displays of violence, they made resistance seem not just dangerous, but impossible. When ancient peoples thought about defying Assyria, they didn't imagine abstract political consequences. They saw those skull towers, they smelled that death, they heard those screams. Their imagination became their prison. But wait, there's another layer to this psychological manipulation that's even more sophisticated. The Assyrians realized that public displays of brutality don't just terrorize the victims, they also corrupt the witnesses. When you watch extreme violence without intervening, your brain experiences what psychologists call moral injury. You begin to see yourself as complicit, weak, cowardly. This self-directed shame makes you even less likely to resist in the future. You're not just afraid of the oppressor, you're ashamed of yourself. The Assyrians turned entire populations into their own psychological jailers. Every person who witnessed the skull displays and did nothing to stop them carried a piece of that trauma forever. They became living repositories of fear, spreading learned helplessness through their families, their communities, their children. The most chilling part: ancient Assyrian records show that even their own soldiers began experiencing what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They reported seeing ghosts of their victims, hearing voices, experiencing what they described as punishment from the spirits of the dead. The Assyrians had created a psychological weapon so powerful that it was destroying the minds of the people wielding it. But that wasn't going to stop them from perfecting the system. By 700 BCE, King Sennacherib had taken Assyrian psychological warfare to its logical extreme. He wasn't content with skull towers and flaying displays. He wanted to break something deeper. He wanted to destroy hope itself. Picture the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE. The city had been holding out for months, but something was different about this siege. The Assyrians weren't just building their usual terror displays, they were conducting what we would now recognize as systematic psychological operations. Every morning, Assyrian heralds would approach the city walls and deliver carefully crafted speeches designed to trigger what modern psychologists call anticipatory anxiety. They would describe in graphic detail exactly what was going to happen to every man, woman, and child in the city. Not threats, detailed, methodical explanations. "Your God cannot save you," they would call out. "Look around, where are your allies? Your own leaders are probably planning to surrender you to save themselves. Why are you dying for people who would sacrifice you without hesitation?" This wasn't random taunting. This was precision psychological warfare designed to activate every human insecurity, abandonment fears, authority distrust, religious doubt, social paranoia. But here's the truly diabolical innovation: Sennacherib began targeting the city's children specifically. Assyrian records document that they would parade captured children from other cities in front of the walls, demonstrating exactly what awaited the young defenders if the siege continued. Can you imagine being a parent on those walls, watching other people's children being systematically tortured, knowing that your own child could be next? Your protective instincts, the deepest biological drives you possess, become weapons against your own resistance. The psychological pressure was so intense that the Bible records people on the walls of Jerusalem literally eating their own children during similar sieges. The Assyrians had discovered how to turn human love itself into a tool of surrender. But Sennacherib's masterpiece wasn't just the siege tactics, it was what happened after cities fell. Instead of the quick, brutal executions of earlier Assyrian kings, Sennacherib developed what can only be described as theatrical torture. Public executions became elaborate performances designed not just to kill, but to maximize psychological impact on witnesses. Ancient records describe the flaying of King Elam's son, while the entire population was forced to watch. But the psychological masterstroke was what happened. Next, they made the king himself participate in dismembering his own child's body as the price for ending his people's suffering. Picture the mind-breaking horror of being forced to choose between watching your child die slowly or killing them quickly with your own hands. Either choice destroys something fundamental in the human psyche. Either choice creates trauma so deep that resistance becomes psychologically impossible. The witnesses to these events didn't just surrender, they became active participants in spreading Assyrian control. They would return to their communities as changed people, carrying stories so psychologically devastating that entire regions would submit rather than risk similar experiences. But here's where the system reached its peak sophistication. Sennacherib realized that the most effective terror wasn't random violence, but violated expectations of mercy. He would show unusual kindness to some cities that surrendered, treating them well, integrating them peacefully into the empire. Word would spread that perhaps Assyrian rule wasn't so bad after all. Hope would begin to return. Then, without warning, he would select one of these favored cities and destroy it completely, often for no apparent reason. The psychological impact was devastating if cooperation offered no protection. If mercy was just another form of manipulation, then what was the point of any resistance at all? This created what modern psychologists recognize as complex trauma, a state where the victim's entire sense of reality becomes unstable. You can't predict what will keep you safe because the rules keep changing arbitrarily. Ancient peoples living under this system developed what we now call hypervigilance, a constant state of threat assessment that exhausts the brain's resources and makes complex decision-making nearly impossible. Perfect conditions for authoritarian control. The most chilling part of Sennacherib's innovations was his use of religious warfare. He didn't just destroy cities, he destroyed the concept of divine protection itself. When the Assyrians conquered a city, they would capture the statues of local gods and display them in chains, being tortured alongside human prisoners. The psychological message was clear: if your gods are powerless to save themselves, how can they save you? But the truly sophisticated psychological operation was what happened next. After destroying local religious sites, the Assyrians would build new temples to Assyrian gods in their place, forcing the conquered populations to worship their conquerors' deities. This created what psychologists now understand as identification with the aggressor, a trauma response, where victims psychologically merge with their oppressors as a survival mechanism. It's the same reason abuse victims often defend their abusers, the same reason hostages develop emotional attachments to their captors. The conquered peoples weren't just submitting to Assyrian political control, they were actively rewiring their own identities, their own belief systems, to align with their oppressors. They became willing participants in their own psychological enslavement. By 650 BCE, King Ashurbanipal had inherited a system so psychologically effective that most of the known world surrendered at the mere rumor of Assyrian approach. The skull towers had evolved into something far more powerful, a self-replicating system of mental control that turned every conquered population into recruiters for their own oppression. But the Assyrians made one crucial mistake. They never imagined that this same psychological weapon could be turned against them. And when it was, their empire collapsed not in decades or years, but in a single generation. Here's how their own system destroyed them, and why you need to understand this pattern before it's too late. Think the age of skull towers is over. Think again. You're living through the most sophisticated psychological terror campaign in human history right now, and you probably don't even realize it. Every morning, you wake up and voluntarily expose yourself to a digital skull tower called your news feed. Mass shootings, political chaos, economic collapse, social division, a carefully curated stream of trauma designed to trigger the exact same learned helplessness that made ancient peoples surrender their cities without a fight. The algorithms know exactly what they're doing. Tech executives have openly admitted that they design platforms to be persuasive, to capture attention, to modify behavior. Sound familiar? That's the exact same language Assyrian scribes used to describe their psychological warfare tactics. Your smartphone isn't just a communication device. It's a personal terror amplification system that delivers systematic psychological conditioning directly into your brain 24/7. But here's where it gets really dark. Just like the Assyrians, modern systems have learned that intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest psychological bonds. Your social media feeds don't show you constant horror, they mix trauma with pleasure, outrage with validation, fear with hope. This creates the same trauma bonding that made ancient peoples emotionally attached to their Assyrian oppressors. You hate your news feed, but you can't stop checking it. You know social media makes you miserable, but you keep scrolling. Your brain has been programmed for digital submission. Corporate executives sit in boardrooms making the same calculations as Assyrian kings. How much psychological pressure can we apply before people break? How can we use fear to modify behavior? How can we turn human insecurity into profit? Modern advertising doesn't just sell products, it systematically erodes your self-worth to create psychological dependency. Every ad is designed to make you feel inadequate, incomplete, threatened. Just like those ancient skull displays, modern marketing creates a state of chronic anxiety that makes you more susceptible to authority and more likely to seek comfort through consumption. Political campaigns have perfected the Assyrian playbook. They don't just promote their candidates, they systematically terrorize you with visions of what will happen if the wrong candidate wins. Your vote isn't based on hope for the future, it's based on fear of alternatives. Remember how the Assyrians used availability heuristic, making resistance seem impossible by flooding people's imagination with vivid images of suffering. Modern media does the exact same thing. When you think about challenging the system, your mind is immediately flooded with images of failure, ridicule, and social punishment. The most chilling parallel is how modern systems target children, just like Sennacherib did at Lachish. Social media platforms are specifically designed to create psychological dependency in developing brains. Children are being systematically conditioned for digital submission before they're old enough to understand what's happening to them. But here's the most terrifying connection. Just like the Assyrians, modern systems create what appears to be choice while actually eliminating real alternatives. You can choose between different brands, different news sources, different social media platforms, but they're all designed to produce the same psychological outcomes: dependency, submission, learned helplessness. The skull towers of ancient Assyria were crude, obvious instruments of terror. Modern psychological warfare is invisible, voluntary, and far more effective. You carry your own skull tower in your pocket, and you pay monthly for the privilege. The question is, now that you can see the system, What are you going to do about it? Because history shows us something crucial about psychological control systems. Here's what the Assyrians never understood about their own system, and it's the key to breaking free from modern psychological control. Every system of terror contains the seeds of its own destruction. The same psychological mechanisms that create learned helplessness can be reversed to create learned resistance. But you have to understand the deeper pattern first. The Assyrian Empire collapsed in 609 BCE, not because of military defeat, but because their psychological control system backfired catastrophically. After generations of systematic terror, something unexpected happened. The traumatized population stopped feeling fear and started feeling rage. What modern neuroscience reveals is that chronic terror eventually triggers what's called post-traumatic growth. When the human brain is pushed beyond its breaking point, it doesn't just break, it rebuilds itself stronger, more resilient, more resistant to future manipulation. The Babylonians and Medes who finally destroyed Assyria weren't just fighting an empire, they were expelling a psychological infection that had poisoned their collective consciousness for centuries. Their victory wasn't military, it was therapeutic. This same pattern repeats throughout history. The Roman Empire, built on systematic terror, collapsed when Christian populations developed psychological immunity to death-based intimidation. Nazi Germany fell when their own psychological warfare tactics were turned against them through Allied counter-propaganda. The Soviet Union crumbled when their people stopped fearing the Gulag and started embracing the possibility of freedom. But here's the crucial insight: resistance isn't just political, it's neurological. Every time you consciously reject a manipulation attempt, you're literally rewiring your brain to become more resistant to future manipulation. The Assyrians failed because they created what systems theorists call a psychological monoculture. They eliminated all competing sources of meaning, all alternative narratives, all diverse perspectives. This made their system incredibly powerful in the short term, but catastrophically fragile in the long term. When a single crack appeared in their psychological dominance, when one population successfully resisted, the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. All their subject peoples suddenly realized that Assyrian power was based on illusion, not reality. Modern digital control systems have made the exact same mistake. They've created psychological monocultures where dissent is algorithmically suppressed, where alternative perspectives are deplatformed, where diversity of thought is systematically eliminated. This makes the system incredibly powerful for controlling behavior in the short term. But it also makes it incredibly vulnerable to what network theorists call cascade failures, moments when mass resistance spreads faster than control mechanisms can respond. The key to resistance is understanding that psychological control systems depend on your participation. The Assyrians needed people to look at the skull towers, to be traumatized by them, to spread fear through their communities. Modern systems need you to engage with the fear content, to share the outrage, to participate in the anxiety cycles. But here's the empowering truth: you have something the ancient world didn't have. You have access to the science of psychological manipulation. You can understand these systems consciously instead of just experiencing them unconsciously. When you recognize a manipulation attempt, label it out loud. This news story is designed to trigger my fear response. This advertisement is trying to make me feel inadequate. This social media post is using outrage to capture my attention. Conscious recognition breaks the unconscious influence. It's like Neo seeing the Matrix code. Once you can see the system, you can't be controlled by it. The most powerful form of resistance is creating what psychologists call psychological sovereignty, the ability to consciously choose your emotional responses instead of having them triggered automatically by external stimuli. Ancient peoples had no choice but to experience the skull towers through their traumatized nervous systems. You have the choice to observe your digital skull towers through your conscious mind. But resistance isn't just individual, it's collective. The Assyrians were defeated when traumatized populations began sharing stories of successful resistance instead of stories of successful submission. Every time you choose consciousness over reactivity, every time you resist a manipulation attempt, every time you help others recognize these systems, you're contributing to what could be the next great cascade failure of psychological control. The question isn't whether these systems will eventually collapse. History guarantees they will. The question is whether you'll be part of the solution or part of the problem. Here's how you can start building psychological immunity today. The skull towers of Assyria weren't just monuments to ancient cruelty, they were prototypes for every system of psychological control that followed. From Roman circuses to Nazi rallies to modern social media algorithms, the pattern is always the same: systematic terror designed to create learned helplessness. But here's what gives me hope: you now possess something more powerful than any ancient king's arsenal of fear. You have conscious awareness of how these systems work. The Assyrians ruled for over 300 years because their subjects couldn't see the psychological chains binding them. You've just spent 30 minutes learning to see yours. Every skull tower in history eventually crumbled. Every system of terror eventually collapsed. Not because of military defeat, but because human consciousness is ultimately stronger than human fear. The digital skull towers surrounding you right now, your news feeds, your social media algorithms, your anxiety-inducing entertainment, they seem permanent, inevitable, insurmountable. But they're built on the same psychological foundations as ancient Assyria, and those foundations are cracking. You're living through the early stages of the next great cascade failure of psychological control. The question is, what role will you play? Will you be part of the solution, consciously resisting manipulation and helping others do the same? Or will you continue participating in your own psychological enslavement? The choice is yours, but choose quickly, because history shows us that when these systems collapse, they collapse fast. If this video opened your eyes to psychological manipulation you hadn't recognized before, hit that like button. If you want to dive deeper into how modern systems of control actually work, subscribe and ring the notification bell. And here's your homework for the next 24 hours. Every time you feel triggered by something online, ask yourself, is this designed to manipulate my emotions? You might be shocked by what you discover. The skull towers are still being built, but this time, you know how to tear them down.